I think when you ask yourself, where are we in terms of regulating, you also have to ask yourself, where are we in terms of the technology? I look at AI and it still looks like early days to me. And I think we're at the point like 2005, the BlackBerry just came out, and we're talking about a regulatory framework for smartphones, right? But what do you know about smartphones if a BlackBerry is all you've seen? There's still a lot of room for this technology to really grow and advance in ways that we can't entirely predict right now. So creating a very constrained federal regulatory environment right out of the gate might not be the wisest thing.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we're glad to be joined again by Chris McKenzie with the Chamber of Progress. Chris, thanks for joining us again. Welcome to the program.
Jarrett, thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence.
Yeah, so last time we got to talk a little bit about media and technology, and kind of why we were talking about that. I said, AI is just everywhere. Ever since Christmas. I remember right before Christmas, I was talking to a programmer and he's like, "Hey, have you seen this thing called Chat GPT?" And I was like, "No, what is that?" And he showed me. And ever since then, I've just kind of been obsessed with it. And everyone else has. And, a million different other apps and websites have come up. And, we've had this big internet rally and kind of looks like this third or fourth tech wave's about to begin. Kind of, can you give us a little background on AI and kind of where it's been, these last few years and how it just kind of exploded on the scene all of a sudden?
Yeah, we've seen so much development over the past year. AI really came to fame quite a bit more with the release of ChatGPT to the public. I know I used that program. My family's since used that program. And for a while last year in 2022, it was actually the fastest growing app on the internet in terms of users. It very, very quickly gained hundreds of millions of users. Since then, it's been surpassed by Threads, which, as you know, recently launched and was able to
Right.
capitalize on the fact that Meta had already launched Instagram. But the quick adoption of ChatGPT for students, for professionals, for a whole range of people who use it for their career and for their personal life has been amazing to watch. And simultaneously, what we've seen is increasing regulatory concerns from lawmakers and from agencies who really don't want to miss out on placing the correct safeguards into place as this technology comes into use. I think a lot of people are looking back at the last tech boom and the fact that we now have these very large tech companies in in the space of social media and search engines, that lawmakers look back on that moment and think maybe we missed the regulatory boat, and there's a fear of doing the same as AI comes into use.
What's interesting about AI is there's just like so many uses for it, right? Like you have it in writing, so you're going to have like copyright, plagiarism issues. You have it in video and pictures where, you can make a video look and sound like someone. So you have impersonation issues, writing music, playing music, it just seems like just boundless issues. Kind of what's at the forefront right now as we kind of are taking a look at this.
Well, I think to start where you're starting, as many uses as there are for AI, there are just as many issues and concerns that consumers and some lawmakers are raising, right? And AI is much bigger than the generative language models that we think of online. When we talk about generative AI, that technology extends far beyond a chatbot or even an image generator online. It's being used in places like the medical field to discover new medicines and treatments for diseases for which we previously had no treatment. It's being used in technology like medical imaging to take an image of someone's internal issues and to use that pattern recognition that AI is so good at to discover what they're ailing from. So there's just a huge range of uses for AI, and as you mentioned, just as many bumps in the road that consumers and lawmakers are raising. So I think the biggest ones that people are asking themselves about right now are, number one, should we have some sort of federal regulatory framework for AI? Number two, what sort of disclosure needs to happen when we interact with AI content or an AI model online? Number three, what copyright concerns are there? When is AI able to look at data online and use that in a model to develop new images? And when are the images or text that it develops an infringement on previously copyrighted material? And then the final concern is around what content an AI model produces and whether it's liable for putting out false or misleading information if a user asks it to.
Yeah. So it kind of seems like the genesis of a lot of this AI is just this increased computing power we have. And now we have these processors we can develop that can kind of, think for themselves practically.
That's, in some ways, that's really, really true, right? The fact that we have these tech giants with just massive amounts of computing power and the ability to process a huge amount of data has actually allowed us to lay the foundation for some of our own domestic AI companies to succeed. And another concern that's coming up is how do we ensure that small AI companies are able to compete in this field where you need a huge and expensive infrastructure to develop a functional AI model, right?
Right.
Because a company like OpenAI, for instance, is going to be working with Microsoft to use its huge computing power in order to move its AI model forward. Facebook, of course, already has the infrastructure to process this huge amount of data. The same can be said of all the tech giants, but how are small tech companies going to compete? And that's one question that lawmakers are asking themselves that we've weighed in on as well.
And kind of what is the Chamber of Progress's kind of, position on some of these points?
Yeah. Well, on that in particular, we wrote a letter recently to the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, Senator Schumer, asking him to ensure that as we come up with a national AI regulatory framework, we don't forget about these small AI companies, right? Number one, we want to make sure that new regulatory barriers, whether there's a new AI federal agency in place or there's a licensing regime put into place where all AI companies have to license their products with this and under this new framework, we want to make sure that the smallest businesses, these AI startups, aren't getting crushed. Because a lot of times what will happen is, bigger tech, big tech, larger companies are very easily able to overcome those regulatory barriers, right? Financially, it's not really a big problem for them. They're able to do that. They have the lawyers on in-house. But for smaller AI companies, it can be a tough issue. And then the second issue we've raised is also this access to computing power is really a barrier for these smaller startups to get going and to compete with the bigger players. And one of the solutions there is actually to fund a national AI research resource, basically a federal cloud resource that has the computing power to host some of the researchers and startups who are interested in testing out and playing around with new AI models. So we would love to see Congress fund that sort of federal data processing, computing power infrastructure in order to enable some of the smaller players to really enter and compete in this space. And that's one of the things that's currently being debated this week as folks are moving forward with the National Defense Authorization Act. Every time Congress moves a big bill, there's a chance for amendments, and people start throwing around all sorts of ideas. So we've been advocating for funding for this project in particular.
That's interesting about Congress is just these big issues, kind of go through and it covers a billion different topics. Kind of it seems like on kind of crypto, they're behind the boat on regulation of kind of cryptos and that sort of technology. Where are we on AI and kind of are we getting in front of it? Are we a little bit behind it? Where are we in terms of regulating it?
Yeah, well, I think when you ask yourself, where are we in terms of regulating, you also have to ask yourself, where are we in terms of the technology? I look at AI and it still looks like early days to me. I see AI and I think we're at the point like 2005, the BlackBerry just came out, and we're talking about a regulatory framework for smartphones, right? But what do you know about smartphones if a BlackBerry is all you've seen? So I think there's still a lot of room for this technology to really grow and advance in ways that we can't entirely predict right now. So creating a very constrained federal regulatory environment right out of the gate might not be the wisest thing. I think that it depends on which lawmaker you talk to, what kind of approach they want to take, right? Senator Schumer, again, I think actually has a very thoughtful approach to some of these issues. He has asked for a wide range of inputs from big tech, from small startups, from organizations like Chamber of Progress, in order to develop national legislation to put safeguards on this technology. You also have, you have new AI legislation, though, coming out every day. Today, Senator Thune from South Dakota introduced his own AI legislation. And I think it generally falls, again, in a few buckets, right, which mirror some of the consumer concerns that we've seen. The first bucket that we've seen is, I would call it transparency legislation. There are a number of bills that would require AI to basically put a stamp on their content that says this content was generated by AI, whether that's picture content or text, or text. There's also licensing regimes that require AI companies to assess whatever risks they think their AI model might pose and then seek a license from a state or federal regulator. And then, finally, there's legislation that addresses basically anti-discrimination in AI as well, ensuring that AI models don't discriminate against users when they're being used for, say, employment purposes or housing purposes. We want to make sure that these AI models don't take data that includes a history of discrimination and then apply that to make discriminatory decisions going forward.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, you're talking about the BlackBerry in 2005. And if you remember back to 2005 and you look at the iPhone you have in your hand now,
It's a different
we've come a
machine.
long way, right?
Yeah.
I was joking with someone, when I talking about when I went to college and you wanted to go somewhere, you actually had to like go online and put it into MapQuest or Google Maps, and you'd have to print it out, and then you'd follow the directions. You didn't have it on your phone or in your car. How quickly we progress. But like AI, it's amazing for what it does right now, and people are concerned about, it's going to replace all these jobs, and it's going to take, the writer's strike here in California it's become very center stage, as a lot of writers fear that the studios are going to start using AI to write scripts and things like that. Kind of where are we currently in AI, and kind of what are the possibilities in 10 years for AI to do?
Sure. I think that I think that we're really early days in where we're seeing this technology develop. In a lot of ways, your online AI chatbot is really a glorified search engine. It's pulling from a number of different websites and just giving you the most likely next word effectively. A lot of the content that it's generating, well, it has a few good party tricks, aren't especially game changing in terms of what we can do professionally yet, right? And that's just for chatbots. Again, AI has actually already changed how we can discover new medicines and stuff like that in the medical field. In terms of its impact on jobs, I think that a recent study was really revealing, that looked at basically supplementing workers in an office with AI who gained the most benefit from being able to use AI in their professional career. And what the study found was that AI gave a boost to the lowest skilled workers in an office. And it really didn't do much for the top skilled workers who are already outperforming their peers. And one of the reasons for that is that AI is really good at reproducing the average, right? It can guess the next most likely word in a sentence. It can say, well, if I was an average worker, this is probably what I would do next, or what I would say next, or the next decision I'd make. It is not good at outperforming basically the top model in a field. So I think one of the possibilities that AI offers is actually to help close the wage gap in some offices by bringing lower skilled workers up to meet their peers who are currently outperforming them.
Interesting. I know it's been used by a lot of coders and things like that. What are the possibilities in I guess using AI to kind of solve some of our more complex computing issues and processes?
I mean, the AI has huge potential to help improve our ability to solve coding problems and to solve bigger global problems. It can be used to help us solve and detect climate change in ways that we haven't looked for before, right? And in a lot of these cases, federal agencies are starting to dabble in AI to see how it can be used, how it can be applied to solve some of these issues. And that's actually one of the first places that I think we're going to see regulation, where a consensus is already forming around how should we regulate AI is actually in the regulation of AI as it's used by government. Some of the bills that made it the farthest in California this year were bills that disclosed to Californians when they were interacting with an AI model that was used by the state government. There's been federal legislation introduced that does something very similar, basically a disclosure, making sure that citizens know when they're interacting with a model, an AI model used by the government. And one of the principles that President Biden has put out is that people should both know when they're interacting with these AI models, and they should be offered, if it's the government, the opportunity to interact with a human instead, right? So anyway, I see these AI models as having a huge amount of potential to solve some of the problems that have stumped our country and the world, including climate change. And I think that government is already in the initial phases of experimenting with how we can better public service with this new technology.
Yeah, it's interesting. The vein of everyone's existence is the DMV, and in the past few years, it's come a long way technology wise. And I guess you could see how maybe an AI chatbot might help move some things along there. Can you kind of go a little deeper on kind of the issues we're seeing in the California legislature this year on AI and things that are being brought up?
Sure. We're nearing the end of the California legislative session. So I think the outlook at this point is that we don't expect any AI bills to move for the remainder of the year. A lot of the bills that have been under consideration have been made 2-year bills. So we expect these legislators to return to them next year. The bills that we've seen fall in a couple buckets. Number one, research. There's legislation that the California lawmakers have considered to look into how do we define AI? How do we define critical risk AI in terms of lawmaking? When you're creating legislation to regulate AI, you don't want to be overbroad. That's actually one of the risks that you run if you end up because AI could be a lot of things. For instance, when I use Excel sometimes suggests to me what I type in the next cell over based on the pattern of the data that I've put into this program. But most Americans wouldn't look at Excel and say, that's an AI model right there, right? So when we create AI regulation, it's really important that lawmakers get it right and find a description of AI that narrowly targets these companies and the highest risk models that we want to be putting these safeguards around. So that's one of the types of legislation that California lawmakers have been considering is how do we define AI? Another type of legislation, again, is focused on regulating the government's use of AI. There was a bill that would have required California to conduct an internal assessment of where is AI already being used by state government. There was another bill that would have required California, again, to disclose when an AI model was being used with a Californian who's interacting with state government. A couple of the larger pieces of AI legislation uh, looked, number one, at preventing algorithmic discrimination by AI. And that would have basically funded California's Civil Rights Department to regulate AI companies. And then a second bill that would have actually created a new agency to regulate AI in California. Both of those bills got stuck in the budgetary process, partially because of California's really large state budget deficit this year. I believe it's over $20 billion. And these pieces of legislation cost, in the $20 million range. So there was a significant amount of funds it would have taken to basically stand up a new agency regulating AI. And lawmakers weren't ready to make that budget sacrifice in a year where there was such a tight fiscal environment.
Yeah, we're kind of in such a kind of unique spot with technology as we have, this class of billionaires who are famous, kind of calling each other out online and challenging each other to fights. Kind of where are the celebrity billionaires on these issues? Where's Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, on Bill Gates too? I guess falls into that. Where do they fall in this
Yeah.
AI world?
I mean, it's been pretty wild to follow some of the back and forth, certainly between these tech billionaires. It gets a little bit petty sometimes. It does feel that way. What I would say is that you know Facebook Meta has put forward an AI model that's actually very unique in that it's open to the public, right? Whereas some of the other companies, Microsoft, OpenAI, for instance, have developed a model that they're going to charge people to use. Facebook has created a system that people can improve upon, basically, with a sort of open source model, right? So that makes Meta's AI approach very unique. Musk this past week announced his new AI company, as if Tesla and SpaceX and Twitter weren't enough. And he has prioritized making his AI company a quote unquote anti woke AI company. Basically, he wants to develop an AI model that rejects all of these liberal premises that other AI models are built on. Basically, where Google's Bard might refuse to read you an offensive hate speech poem or something like that, right? Musk's AI model would happily offer it, right?
It would be
Musk
mean
has.
Yeah.
Musk has had this war on content moderation since before he took Twitter over. He has made it clear that he thinks that tech companies are censoring conservative speech, and he wants to be a counterweight to that. What consumers are saying, on the other hand, is very different, right? What they're doing is very different. Consumers have shown that they really value content moderation, and they're willing to migrate to platforms that take content moderation seriously, remove hate speech, remove violent content, remove offensive content. And so that's one of the reasons that we've seen a decline in Twitter. That's one of the reasons that platforms like Gab and Parler and President Trump's Truth Social never took off. But we would expect something very similar with Musk's AI company, right? If he's launching an AI company trained on hate speech and violent images, I just don't think that a lot of consumers are going to want to go and use that platform. And so I don't expect a lot from it. OpenAI, Sam Altman, I think has stayed out of this sort of contest between tech billionaires for the time being. He has testified before Congress. He's the only real tech mogul at this point to testify before Congress, and he's focused on his company and what his vision for AI regulation in the United States is. So that's where the culture of AI tech moguls is right now.
Yeah, one thing you noticed mentioned earlier was kind of like the tech competition. Kind of what are some of the small businesses that are emerging in this space, and kind of what are they looking at? I remember a time when AOL, Time Warner used to dominate the internet scene, and Google was a startup. So, what are some of these small
Everybody
companies?
used it.
Yeah, you had no
Yeah,
choice,
I
right?
mean, I think some of the small companies, obviously, most consumers haven't heard of them at this point simply because they are small. They don't have a lot of users. They're still testing their models. But there are a lot of stories coming out of Silicon Valley right now about these AI houses where you have these really young developers, these young entrepreneurs, basically going into these group quote unquote hacker houses and developing their new ideas, their new companies. And you do have a lot of capital coming into the area as well to invest in these new ideas. Not all of them are language models. Again, some of them apply AI to different fields, whether that is a field like hiring or a field like medicine or a field like detecting climate change. So there's a lot of new startups and a lot of enthusiasm, certainly in Silicon Valley, for launching new businesses. And at the same time, you've seen an influx of capital to fund those new ideas. So I think over the next few years, we're really going to find out what thrives, what grows in that environment, and consumers will be able to see the fruits of those entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Online privacy is something, at least here in California, that has been kind of the top of the legislators' topics, and it's something that just kind of touched me the other day. I got my email hacked, but kind of it's very unique with AI because it's kind of like some of these companies or online hackers can kind of take these frauds a step further. Kind of what are some of the things we can expect into kind of protecting online privacy, kind of with the forefront of AI being here?
Sure, AI, the privacy concerns are a little bit reversed from what we normally think of when we interact with a social media platform. Usually, when we interact with a social media platform, we bring our data trail to that social media platform, and it is able to monitor what pages we visit, what groups we like, etc. And that creates privacy concerns that stem from that monitoring. Right, when we interact with a generative AI, the privacy concerns are effectively already built into the model. Right, the privacy concerns are what data has this model already scraped in order to develop this generative
Interesting.
AI. In a lot of cases, we see some concerns from authors and artists who've created copyrighted work that they believe has been scraped into these AI models. There are also, creators of content whose work isn't copyrighted, who are saying even though I don't have this copyright protection, I never consented to have my data, to have my work scraped up by this AI model. And those are really two separate buckets of concerns in terms of how they're going to be addressed by the courts, right? For copyrighted artists and creators, we've seen some of those concerns moving through the courts, and there, may be some sort of settlement at some point. There was a case this week where a judge was considering a number of comic creators who say their work had been scraped up by AI. And when you asked the AI to generate a comic in their style, the AI would reproduce something that was so similar that it had to have basically scraped their work to create the model, right? And the judge dismissed most of the plaintiffs in that case, but kept one who said might have an actual case against this AI model. So I think we're going to find out how some of these privacy concerns are resolved in court under existing copyright law. because again, we do have the laws there that if these AI models are abusing content and data that is stored online, that is copyrighted, then they are liable under the current law. So we'll find out about that.
Interesting. As you noticed, we're coming to an end of a California session, and DC, you got a couple more months until the end of the year. Are you seeing hopeful
If
that
you
we're
round up. Yeah.
Are you hopeful anything's going to happen on AI regulation this year, or you think this is something that's going to, I guess, take a while for them to really get their hands on?
I actually am hopeful. I really am. I think that number one, I think lawmakers have a real interest in working on this topic, and that extends across the aisle. As AI has come onto the scene, Republicans and Democrats have both shown an interest, and the issue's so new that it honestly hasn't divided along partisan lines the way many other issues have. So there's a lot of room for bipartisan cooperation. In addition to that, we see congressional leaders, again, like Senator Schumer, has taken a real interest in AI and in passing legislation that creates safeguards and ensures U.S. competitiveness in AI as well. That's the other issue where I wouldn't be surprised to see Congress act. Right now, China is, really funding its AI research very well, in the tens of billions of dollars that this country is pouring into AI research every year, and the U.S. federal government, does have a need to keep up with China, especially if we want to make sure that our military, our federal agencies are resourced with this new technology in a way that they aren't falling behind an international rival. So I expect to see movement in Congress on that issue as well, especially after last year when we saw Congress come together in a surprise move and pass the CHIPS Act, funding semiconductor research and production in the United States to keep up with China. That was a very similar issue in that, again, there was this threat that the US was falling behind in this key technology, and Congress was able to find a bipartisan path forward. So I think that the same could be true of AI.
Kind of where are we as the U.S. in terms of AI versus China or other, I guess, national or worldwide powers?
Yeah. Well, I would say that China's hot on our tail, but the U.S. does have the best AI models and the best AI companies in the world. Part of that is, are certainly one of our competitors when we talk about the economy is Europe. And Europe has a very different regulatory approach than the US, especially when it comes to tech. Europe has regulated more to ensure competition between companies, where the US has regulated to prevent harm to consumers. Those are two very different regulatory models to follow, right? And in Europe, that's basically resulted in no single company taking off in the way that Google, Meta, Apple, Microsoft have all come to dominate the tech scene.
Right.
If you look at the top 10 tech companies in the world, none of them are from the EU. If you look at the top 20 tech companies in the world, like maybe one of them is from the EU. And part of the reason for that is, again, this difference in regulatory approaches, where the EU has cracked down on, any company that looks like it might be getting too big. And they've been more preemptory with a lot of regulations. We've also seen countries like Italy threaten to enact new AI regulations that have actually resulted in OpenAI momentarily saying we're going to pull our services from this country, right? Because we can't even exist under this regulatory regime. Mm-hmm. So the US's approach to consumer-oriented tech regulations has really allowed our tech sector to really be in the lead in terms of innovation, and that includes in the field of AI. That said, what China's really good at is federal investment. They don't have the same hangup as we do. They don't have the same partisan debates on the House floor as we do. when they realize the need to compete in this new and emerging technology, right? So that's going to be where they really have an opportunity to come and match us in this new sector.
Wow. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting topic. I bet we're going to be hearing a lot about this in the next year or so, especially with the presidential primaries coming up. It should be interesting to see the woke versus non-woke AI arguments out there.
I know we'll hear a lot about it. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jarrett.
All right. Thanks, Chris.